All right, my strong inspiration viewers. Y'all my family now, wherever you are, because y'all embracing what I'm doing here. I can feel the love. I'm telling you, I think about it at night, sometimes, and I be like, yeah, this thing is really happening. And I got some good people that is, really kind of supporting this effort now. They calling me. I got one lady, she want to come on once every 3 months. Wow. I do people more than one time because they got more than one little story to fit in a half an hour. And my man that's on the channel now, he got backdrop, he got HB, he got flyers and all kind of stuff behind him. I know he gonna put it on us. He nodding his head, he say, man, I got it going on. I know what I'm talking about. Let me tell these people about the black folks that went to black colleges and they was athletes. That's just a little clue as to what we're gonna talk about. But before we go into that, my friends, I really would appreciate it. And a lot of y'all doing it because I can feel it. Every day I look up, I got new subscribers. So hit the subscribe button, please, my friends. It's free. You can subscribe to this for free. It just let me know you're watching and I know who you are. And then hit the like button on this video. Hit the like button on this video. Hit the notifications bell. It's a little bell down at the bottom. Hit that. All that's free. And then, because I'm putting, 3-4 videos up a week now. I'm putting them up on you and you get a little ding when I put them in, because I don't have no scheduled time when I do it. It's just when the vibe hit. And then, everybody, come on, check it out. I'm a filmmaker, and I did this documentary called Business in the Black, The Rise of Black Business in America. We talk about all HBCUs. We named several of them and gave some stories behind them. And it's 75 minutes long. It's a powerful, powerful film. Be good with a bowl of popcorn and some Kool-Aid. Drink some Kool-Aid. You ain't had no Kool-Aid. Drink some Kool-Aid with this. It'll really bring you back, and you'll enjoy watching my film. And it's streaming on Amazon, so you can get the DVD or you can just watch it on your computer, your laptop. And then, as you might know, I also went one step further and I wrote a book about it. See, because I follow through on my thing, right? That's been my Mirandi, my mode of operation. Follow through, everybody. So I followed through and I wrote this book. And it took me several months. I already had a lot of the research for the movie. I just added more facts. And then I wrote it the way I would like to read it, with no commentary, just give you the facts, because so I make it, it's real easy to do, to read my book. I've been saying, and I got it from somebody. They said it was the most comprehensive, easy to read Black history book that they ever had. It's that good. It's called Black Business Book, and it's also on Amazon. And if you order one, I'll autograph it for you. Shoot, man, come on. I'm so happy you bought my book. My God, I'll autograph it for you. But then if you want to cut to Amazon, man, I'll just go to my website. Go to businessintheblack.net. Go to that one. I got 2 websites. I got a whole bunch of social media stuff. I'm on Instagram, A Strong One and the number 1. I'm on Twitter, A Strong Dream is my Twitter feed. I'm in Facebook. I'm in a bunch of groups. But that's enough said, man. I'm tired. I'm ready to let this brother, he gonna roll. I'm gonna just ask him a couple questions. I had to get that part out of the way, though, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Brother, go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about you, and let's do this.
Yes. First, let me say thank you for reaching out to me, inviting me on. Yeah. I am Jafus Cavil. I'm a professor of sport management at Texas Southern University. And I developed the sport management program, but really my research interest is on the leadership of HBCU athletic programs.
Yeah.
Specifically looking at HBCU programs from a historical perspective as well, which kind of leads me into some of the talk that we'll talk about today.
Let me stop you right there. So you got your doctorate?
Yes, I have an education doctorate of education in administration and leadership.
Where you from? Where you from, man?
I'm from Waco, born in Norman, Oklahoma, My parents went to OU, but my grandparents went to Prairie View.
Your grandparents went to college?
Yeah, I was fortunate. My grandparents, grandmother was one of the first nursing classes there at Prairie View, coming out of New Orleans, Louisiana. But my granddad is from Greater Texas, and he went to Prairie View, and he was one of the first 2 commissioned officers at Prairie View A&M University when Prairie View went to having commissioned officers.
Now, what do you mean by commissioned officers? What do you mean by that? What's that?
So if you go to universities, you can come out with your degree and you'll be a commissioned officer, means you go straight into the officer ranks.
Oh, in the service.
Really, when people go into the military, they come in as enlisted men out of high school. Many of them go through the college rank, and because of the college degree, if you would, they go in as officers.
Now, how did your great grandfather, if you know this story, we're gonna get to your piece in a second. How he get to college, man? How he get to college?
His father, who's also named after his brother, with Jafus, and they wanted African Americans to be educated, and so Prairie View A&M University, which is the second established institution of higher education, obviously for African Americans, had a lot of people going down.
It's the second what now?
It's the second oldest institution of higher education in the state of Texas.
Oh, in the state of Texas. Okay, I got you. Yeah, and it was founded when?
1876.
So that's like that's 12 years after slavery ended, so to speak.
That's right. Officially, yep.
And what was the state of Texas at the time? Was Texas a free? Was it free down in Texas? They had slaves, I know.
Yeah, no, it was an enslaved state. It enslaved Africans, and those Africans that were born in the United States, because at that time, obviously, there was no citizenship, and so you were going through terminology of moving from Africans to Negro to colored people. So they had enslaved Africans in the state, and they kind of went back and forth. Remember, you have the historical framework where Mexico was in that area, and then you have Texas and the battles became its independent, was an independent country at one point.
Texas was, really? Okay.
Yeah, one of the reasons you have them with the Lone Star flag, and they actually can fly the flags at the same staff because it was an independent nation at that time, but financially couldn't hold itself together, and eventually came a part of the United States. And as it came in as enslaved of African state at that time. So yeah, very fascinating history when you talk about.
Man, I for some reason I heard that one star was because they was the last one to hold out to let the enslaved know that they were free. That's not necessarily the reason.
No, they had the star before that. The history in regards to that is that they were, in a lot of ways, one of the last states that, again, I use the terminology, new Africans, the Africans in this area, were learned of the end of the Civil War and were actually enslaved. And people, kind of joke about that in terms of that, but you got to really go back and understand the history at the time. You weren't driving cars, you didn't have telephones, for example, and mass media. So you literally had to wait for the federal army to come in, and they took the ships around, and they came into Galveston Bay. And if you think about it, you had Union soldiers versus the Confederate soldiers, even though they had got whooped by the Union, they were not too happy about the idea of African Americans being able to have their own lot in life.
Yeah.
And because they were enslaved, you had a lot of states that had more Blacks, African Americans, Negroes, colored folks, more than the population. So a lot of them, because of their mindset of how they treated these individuals, were scared to death. Particularly when you understand a lot of these people fought for their freedom in the war, learned how to use guns and things of that nature.
You say who are you talking about there? Who are you talking about?
I'm talking about the Africans that were free.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, enslaved individuals in the state. And I want people to understand, I don't like using the terminology slaves.
Yeah, a lot of people. Yeah, that's the way. Yeah.
Yeah. So you talk about enslaved folks, because you look, the slaves is almost, if you take away their dignity and their name, these were human beings. These were individuals. These were not
brother.
a category or framework where you talk about individuals and their terminology. So in my courses, when we start talking about the history of HBCU, we tie it back into Africa and the nations that were over there. And we just don't start the history from the enslavement of Africans in the US. It's important to go past that so you understand, you have a different mindset about how you see yourself and your people. So that's a purposeful ideology that I communicate with people in my students.
How did enslaved people get to Texas then?
Most folks were brought out there from people that were searching for new land that they could crop. So as the people started moving west, whether it was first coming out of Florida, Georgia, and some of them even coming from Virginia, they were hearing about land was available and open. So people would move out there, and you had the US that would actually, and Texas, that would give people land. Obviously, it wasn't necessarily the land for them to give, but that's a different story in terms of people of the area. So yeah, it's a fascinating historical look when you start really taking a deeper dive and understanding what took place versus what oftentimes we're taught in our historical classes, which is why I think what you're doing is such a very important component of educating people beyond what they may normally get.
Yeah, well, I couldn't do it without you, my brother. Tell me, you know more than I do. So let me go into this then. So now, Black folks have always had special skills. When we got into the wars and stuff like that, man, I'm sure them brothers knew how to shoot a little bit better, or we just got that eye and that swagger about ourselves. So then we go up from having that natural ability, adding some education, and then we're now developing colleges. Back in 1837, we had Cheney during slavery.
That's right. Before you had the actual war, you had African Americans and those folks that were providing solidarity with them, understanding that one of the ways that you could tie off the chains of oppression was to be educated.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to keep somebody with the enslaved mentality if they're educated. And a lot of that is crossed over to religious frameworks. You had this delineation where some people did not want to educate people that were enslaved, Africans, for that portion of time, if you would. But also the fact that you had religious folks that believing that if you provided a religious framework, then they would be more docile. But in a lot of ways, that was just the opposite.
Now, I really like what you're saying, and that we were able to do that sidebar that you had that. And so I'm gonna try to get down to where we want to go with these Black people going to college at these HBCUs, and they're going into the athletics. Can this be an entree into that discussion? Were there any sports that Black people could play during slavery?
Yeah, we didn't have the same framework of what you would think about the sporting context of now, but your question is important, because you're right. There is a direct roadmap, if you would, even going all the way back to the ancient civilizations in Africa, Nubia or Egypt. Wrestling was significant at that time, and so that is a sporting framework that continues to this day. We hear from Greece, right, Romans, but they actually got it from Africa when you talk about Egypt and Nubia, where still in Ethiopia, they have a significant country relationship with wrestling, where it's still big to the day. But when you start talking about it, you do when enslaved Africans, in a lot of ways, they would bring some of those games over in terms of wrestling. You also had folks that would escape, if you would, or at night when they would have their time of freedom, they would leave, and a lot of times it was running, just to feel the natural freedom that they get, even though some of them would literally return before dawn and work. But it was a way.
Hold on. What now? You doing something from what you just say, man?
Yeah, some of them would escape literally for freedom, to try to escape as far as they can. But you got to remember, some of them had families. So they didn't want to leave their family. So they would leave at dark or whenever they had the ability and they would go play sporting games. The psychological try to have some comforts in their way. So there are multiple frameworks of how people seek freedom. Sometimes it's literally a freedom of removing the shackles and trying to find a location, whether it was escaping to Mexico, whether it was escaping to Florida at one time with the indigenous individuals, which we now seem to call Seminoles, or whether it was going all the way into the Caribbeans to Haiti, whether it was going up north into Canada, Nova Scotia, or Africanville, or whether it was going out west. So these folks were moving everywhere. And then you have the Maroons going up in North Carolina in terms of the swamps and different areas like that. So these folks were not just moving. We tend to think about the frameworks of moving down the Underground Railroad, which tends to, in most of our minds, going up north. But these folks were going any and everywhere they could to escape being enslaved in this country. So to close on that in terms of sporting, yes, you had wrestling, you had some boxing. Some of that was forced. Some of that was individual boxing. Sometimes you had enslavers actually forcing enslaves to box for money, almost like you would do the rooster fights. You had this with, you had that. So yes, there was sporting context during that period of time that leads to where the nation kind of moves into more traditional sports that we see today.
When is there some Black guy that can be considered maybe one of the first to play sports at a college, a white institution?
In 1920, when you talk about Paul Robeson, is what I'm thinking about as one of the biggest names out there, and that has kind of shined when he starts playing at Rutgers, which is the same time frame when Ben Cavil is playing in a lot of ways. But there are a couple of individuals that become stars during that period of time.
Let me ask you this: what was the first team that an HBCU had? What HBCU had the first sports team?
That's fascinating history. It kind of depends on what sport you look at. If you look at football, you know, one of the biggest games was played out of what teams would be coming out of the CIAA in terms of in late 1800s between what is now Johnson C. Smith, when they played a famous game up there with when they were previously Biddle College in terms of that matchup. So that's fascinating when you look at that history. Baseball, you have more what was Clark College now playing at Atlanta University and Morehouse, as they had games in baseball that was played. And then you can go and track back to Black Fives, basketball leagues in a lot of ways, which they would call Cagers or Black Five teams, which were essentially the same framework what you think with the Negro League, right? But this was in the East Coast. Well, you have the story essentially where you have these teams coming out of that area playing professional basketball, and you have in Washington, D.C., which you have the YMC 12 Streeters, because there was not necessarily this framework where we think about amateur and professional teams that we see now, specific college. It was kind of all together. They just played. There weren't designation. So even when we get into Ben Cavil, when we'll talk about a little bit, he played for 5 years. It wasn't until the end of his college playing days that they made the rule where you can only play essentially 4 years. And later you have these rules where you can't play in freshman. So you got to think about these people like crossover. And the amateurs, Jesse Owens ran amateur track right at Ohio State. And then the next year he's running in the Olympics and trying to have a professional career. So you have these crossovers from going into the Negro Leagues, playing in Waco for Paul Quinn College. When you look at some of these players playing, like I said, in terms of Clark Atlanta. So you have all types of things. Some players playing at Dillard University over the years in terms of his previous name. So it's all mixed up in there, and there's no like definitive line where you can just kind of say it starts here and starts there. But to get back to the other framework that you talked about, which is unique history, the 12 Streeters end up becoming the first basketball team at Howard University, which ultimately creates the first commerce affiliation of HBCU teams, which is CIAA.
That's the first division, CIAA.
Right, 1912, okay. The Central Intercollegiate Athletic Association, which was originally called the Colored Intercollegiate Athletic Association. And then you get the SIAC in 1913, and later, which is the Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Conference. And later you get the Southwestern Athletic Conference in 1920, Midwestern Athletic Association around 1940 in those time frames. So they start to come together. But yes, it was the professional type teams, an individual collection of amateur teams that actually creates this nature of colleges, specifically historically Black colleges, forming these teams that ultimately create conferences.
When did the so we're going to say Howard maybe had one of the first teams?
Yeah, certainly. It's one of the first ones. You can say that pretty quick, especially in the sport of basketball. Like I said, Johnson C. Smith, when you talk about football, in a lot of ways.
Now, when was Johnson C. Smith? When did that happen for them?
That's late 1800s.
Oh, man, that's all right. And so the colleges understood that they had these athletes that were going to the school and that they had talent. Let's put a team together as part of our student body offering.
Yes, the students were the bigger pushers of this. They wanted to have type of entertainment besides just going to school. So they asked a lot of the faculty and presidents to play football. Oddly enough, some presidents were not excited about this. And you got to also remember, when you start thinking about the game of football, it's not like what we think today with the pads and the helmets. And remember, they were not playing with helmets at all at first. And then later they had the leather helmets, which is famous, which again is the way that Ben L. Cavil played. He played with the leather helmets, which is fascinating to me. But unfortunately, because the game in a lot of ways was similar to a rugby style, that there were a lot of injuries. And you actually had to have presidents come in that talk about the safety of the game. So you had a lot of presidents and some parents, although the student body wants to play in the game, that they didn't, because they were thinking more academically, educational. Remember, we're still talking about, particularly in the African-American community, there's a lot of thoughts about which way do we go? Do we spend the time with sports, or do we do this more academically, the talent 10 framework and all these things? So there was a juxtaposition back and forth about how do you show your manhood or your Americanness, your civilian component of becoming part of the nation state. Which road do you take? So there wasn't a clear path of what people thought. There were mixtures in terms of how you do, and it kind of the time.
So now, when the HBCUs are starting now having teams, what is there one school? I know Grambling comes to mind as the more famous of the football teams because of Eddie Robinson. Are there other famous schools?
That comes a little late, but Grambling is probably that modern time, if you would, as I kind of talk about in my book here, is that modern framework when you look at it. But just to put a pin on it, to make sure I had this for you, in 1892, you had the game that featured Biddle College, which now is Johnson C. Smith that I was talking about, playing Livingston College, which is the first HBCU football game in 1892, played on December 27th. Actually played in the front lawn of the university, if you would, in the snow, where the students literally made the cleats and the uniforms for the players to play, just to put a pin in some specificity to that framework that you had.
Yeah. How many pros are there from football and basketball from HBCUs? How many would they say? Is there any, like there might be thousands or something like that, or?
Yeah, over the years, there's certainly thousands, because you have some schools like Tennessee State, Grambling University that you talked about, FAMU, that have 100+ players alone in each of those institutions. So over a period of time, you have the largest number of Hall of Famers that played at HBCUs.
Really?
As a conglomerate. In fact, you have the SWAC that has more Hall of Famers currently than what many people think are the best college in terms of SEC. But when you talk about that over this period of time, in a lot of ways, as you start to get into this desegregation period in 1950s and 1960s, when you started seeing the integration of the league, when they opened the doors for African Americans, most of the great talent that you think about were at HBCUs. So you see a floodgate at some point in time, 60s and 70s, where you get this talent infusion in the AFL, NFL, if you would now, what we call in terms of NFC and AFC in terms of that, that are going to these leagues. And they're going to get these players from the HBCUs, namely, as you said, Prairie View, Southern, Grambling State, Tennessee State, FAMU, Morgan State. You know, you talking about Jackson State with 4 Hall of Famers, Morgan State with 4 Hall of Famers, FAMU with the Hall of Famer, Prairie with the Hall of Fame, right? Grambling with their Hall of Famers,
Yeah,
Southern University
with
Hall of Famers. And
I like it.
It continues to just show that. So this is unfortunately some of that hidden history that's not necessarily out there unless you are often coming from an HBCU perspective,
Yeah,
where
I like it.
that really talk about that. You know, Bethune-Cookman, Bishop College that is closed has a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, I like that.
So
let me ask you this.
one of
Sort
the
of
first Super Bowls,
there was a team of Black players that went to a white school. It made a movie out of it. They played basketball and they end up either they won the championship or they lost the championship. Was that?
Yeah, that's Texas Western. They beat Kentucky, which is probably one of the first known desegregated games of a championship, because Texas Western put up 5 Black players in the opening lineup to play in that game. But just before that, to really think it interesting again, a lot of ways, it's kind of looking at this through this whiteness lens. We celebrate the Black players playing at a white institution, which is significant. Before that, though, you had HBCUs that were literally fighting to be included in the NAIA tournament, and NCAA as well, but they weren't even in NCAA at that time. They first got to play in the NAIA as they desegregated in the 50s. And they had this district they ended up calling District 29, where they actually brought in 8 HBCU teams that were some of the best HBCUs that had won that conference, whether they were coming out of the Southwestern Athletic Conference, the Midwestern Athletic Conference, the CIAA, SIAC, and a couple of other ones that have since ceased to exist. And they would take these top 8 teams and they would play them in this district. The winner of the district would get the entrance into the NAIA tournament. That was in the 1950s. In 1952, if you would, you have Texas Southern. Tennessee State ended up being the first team that gets the bid, beating teams in the 8 teams and playing that. But it was a year later when you had Texas Southern University that plays for the first desegregated championship in basketball in the NAIA. They lose to McNeese State. Oddly enough, in that story that makes it so interesting is, again, the racism in the South. The governor of Louisiana told McNeese and the president that they couldn't play in the tournament because the tournament was allowing Black institutions and Black players to play in the tournament. They sneak out and go in the tournament. As history would have it, they actually defeat 3 HBCUs in the tournament to actually win the championship when they defeat Texas Southern University. Year later, you get Tennessee A&I, that's now Tennessee State, coached by John McClendon, the legendary Hall of Famer, that literally changed the game of basketball. That starts his 3-year championship run in the NAIA, which is before UCLA runs off its consecutive championships. So this is different when you start thinking about not just individuals that are desegregated. Man, now we're talking about institutions that are getting a chance.
I got you.
You have Prairie View that plays football for the first desegregated championship team when they played St. John's out of Minnesota. 4 teams were allowed to play for the NAIA football championship in the 60s. And Prairie View loses in the championship game. And then you come all the way around to the 70s when you have FAMU that actually wins a championship in football, which becomes the first one. You have Winston-Salem State in basketball a couple of years before that wins NCAA Division II when the NCAA finally starts to desegregate. But you have probably the greatest decade of championship runs from HBCUs from the late 50s to the 60s, where there was one point where in about a 12, 11-year period where you have HBCUs winning 8 national NAIA basketball championships.
Ooh, yes, sir. Tell it, man. Tell it, man. I ain't gonna stop you. Tell it. When did them big football classes come on board?
That is a great question. I'm glad you asked that. The second oldest classic, when you start thinking about the Rose Bowls, come back to Texas. You have the Rose Bowl, which everybody knows is the oldest, and one of the second oldest is the Cotton Bowl. But in the mix between that is the State Fair Classic. It starts in 1925. You have a Prairie View Bowl that is played around that time as well. So the State Fair Classic that now features Grambling and Prairie View has this history that goes all the way back to 1925.
Oh, really?
Which,
Yeah.
oddly enough, is the first year Cavil plays in there as a freshman, as a fullback for the Wiley College team as they play in that game. So it's fascinating. Then you got to talk about the Orange Blossom Classic, which was huge by Coach Gaither. That becomes a legendary classic in a lot of ways. It's played at the end of the year.
Where's that at?
Today have their history tied all the way back. One of the longest played classic games played between Tuskegee and Morehouse, the Morehouse Tuskegee Classic.
Now, that other one that you mentioned right before that, where was that one played at? Who was that?
The Orange Blossom Classic is played in Florida. It's played in a couple of spots, but mainly it starts off in Miami, Florida. And this is where Jake Gaither would commission the next best team in HBCU sports, or one that they thought would, and they would pay him literally to come down to play in the Orange Blossom Classic, what ultimately becomes the de facto Black College National Championship games, because a lot of the Black newspapers would pick whoever won that game essentially for a championship. There's a couple of other ones out there that some would play in, the Boardwalk Classic and things of that nature over a period of time. But the two quintessential classics in a lot of ways at the end of the year was the Prairie View Classic, played in Houston and Prairie View, and the Orange Blossom Classic played, which was the Prairie View Classic, as you imagine, was governed in Prairie View by the legendary coach Billy Nix when he won his 5 championships in over 18-year play. And some of his biggest games were played against Jake Gaither, the legendary coach of FAMU, when they would tussle back and forth. There were a couple of years where they played 2 or 3 years where they would trade for Black College National Championships, playing each other, having some of the best players that have ever played the game.
Let me kind of end on this question maybe. What was the biggest victory of a Black HBCU over a white institution? Has anyone, like in basketball or something, I guess it would have to be basketball, has a Black college ever beat University of Kentucky or one of them other big powerhouses that just shocked the world?
Yeah, some of those would be done in like more modern time in terms of non-conference games. Obviously, at Texas Southern, they'd be the top 25 Michigan State team. About during the regular season. Historically, probably one of your big games, the Southern in the 40s played in the first desegregated regular season football game, if you would, when they went out to California and played San Francisco and beat them up. You had FAMU when they defeated Miami right before they took off on their acceleration and started becoming a national power. You have that matchup, which was huge because it was a desegregated game. You have Tennessee State that was winning some bowl games in the late 60s when you more of a regional format, and they were beating teams like Ball State and things of that nature. Middle Tennessee State.
I like it.
Yeah, as I told you, Prairie View, some of its games. So you have a couple of them out there. You have Morgan State that played in the what would be now called the Citrus Bowl, I believe it was. Okay. In terms of that, and they get a win over a historically white college university, as I like to refer them, to provide a leveling framework. But that's in football. In basketball, obviously, it's going to be the national championship games, whether it's Tennessee A&I winning those 3 consecutive games over historically white colleges. You have, obviously, Winston-Salem State with Earl to Pearl winning its Division II national championship game in basketball. You have Kentucky State that does what Tennessee A&I, now Tennessee State does, and it wins 3 consecutive championships. You have Texas Southern, which is essentially the last NAIA team to win a championship with Coach Bob Moore. One thing that I do want to get out there was an official game historically that's important is the game that John B. Clinton played against Duke University with his North Carolina Central game, which is called the Secret Game. I have a little book back here. Well, North Carolina Central runs all over Duke, and this is a Duke team that have alumni playing the game, but they previously played at Duke and were doing well.
Wow,
So that's
yeah.
game over the years that has become.
Yeah, glad you got that in. Now you got a book out, right? Is that your book? You got a book out.
Yes, this is
And show it to us. Show it to us.
Thank you. It's a co-edited book that I did.
Oh yeah, look at him bending backwards. I see it.
Yeah, this is the athletic experience at historically Black colleges and universities.
Yeah.
That's a drum major there. We call it the past, present, and persistence, where we look at the book. It's edited by Dr. Billy Hawkins, Dr. Joseph Cooper, Dr. Keela Carter-Franzik, and myself. And then there's a specific chapter in there with some of the information that we're talking about now, where I take a deeper dive and really break down different components of there in the chapter where I talk about the early history of HBCUs.
And the book is available on Amazon?
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon. Yes,
okay.
Sir.
Do you have a website yourself?
Yes, you can go to thgagency.com. That's T as in Tom, H as in Henry, G as in Greg, agency.com.
Okay. Okay, everybody. Did he put his on us, man? That brother, he doing stuff. I was trying to stump him too. I tell you, I really was. He said, man, you can't stump me. I was trying to come up with something. I'm like, what about this? Oh, he's like, man, I got you. Man, I really appreciate you being on the show because you put it on us, man. I ain't gonna lie to you. Everybody, this is what we do with Strong Inspirations. I find these smart people, these PhD guys, and they tell it, give it to us straight. And so come on, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button on this video, hit the notifications bell, read my book, watch my movie, read his book. Come on now, read his book. Because we all like that kind of good story stuff that he has. Go to his website. We're gonna stay in touch. And so,
no doubt about it. One other thing I would ask them to consider is I actually do a weekly show. It's live. Yeah. You can go to, like you said, YouTube at Dr. Cavill's Inside the HBCU Sports Lab, or catch us live on Facebook every Tuesday and Thursday, where we do more of a modern look at HBCUs. So we talk about the games of the week. In every sport, we do it year round. So during football season, obviously it's football. During basketball season, then baseball season in spring, and then we do some stuff like this during the spring.
And it's called what now? What's it called again? Dr.
Cavill's Inside the HBCU Sports Lab.
All right.
Mike Washington.
All that in the description. Yeah, we're gonna put it in the description. And my man be plugging this thing too. That's like that. Go on and plug it. Let the people know. Come on, folks. So to you, my brother, I want to say this. I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind, because we really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you so very much for being on the channel. Much love. We out, everybody.